What is up everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In my last video I showed you guys how to use the Kaleido Sniper M2 roaster. So if you're looking how to use it, click down there or here or wherever I can put the thing, go and check that video out if you need some advice. But in this video we're going to take a really deep dive into this roaster and I'm going to tell you guys what I think. Because I've got a whole list of pros and cons on this thing, but you're going to have to wait to check that out. Let's go! So first up, we are going to talk about the positives of this roaster. Number one, we're going to talk about the price, because it is quite an attractive price. Here in Australia, depending on which model you get, this one is around $4,000. This is the model that allows you to use the tablet or the laptop, which you can hook up to Artisan if you want to be a little bit more specific, a little bit more refined with your roasting. Some of the other models are close to the $3,000 mark. And this will vary depending on the US dollar at the time, so these prices may change depending on when you're watching this. But there are models which allow you to only use this and some other features as well. Then there are other sizes. This is the 400 gram capacity roaster, but we'll touch base on that shortly. Now another positive, and this is a bit more of an opinion, I think it looks pretty cool, especially with those wings opened. It's just funky, it's something a little bit different, very futuristic looking, rather than just another square box that you can pour coffee into. And one of the other features of it that I quite like is the size of it. The footprint is quite small, as you can see. When you look at photos of it, it actually looks quite large, but then you see it in person and it's very, very small. That's what she said! Now a good thing due to the size is the fact that it makes it quite portable. I've carried this around, I've taken it to a few places to do some roasts, mostly just for fun, but if you are a little bit of a traveller and you want to take it to cafes and other places, you can definitely do that as well. And it only requires a standard 10 amp power point. So I can take this anywhere in Australia, plug it into the wall and turn it on. Now with this model, like I said earlier, it does give you the ability to use the screen, or you can hook up via Bluetooth to an Artisan on your laptop. However, the tablet is perfectly fine, especially if you already know how to roast. It does give you all the necessities and the things that you need if you already know what you're doing. So probably the key feature that was important to me is consistency. When it comes to brewing coffee, I am all about consistency and removing variables. So if we can't do the same thing over at the roasting, it's going to make that job at the brewing end very, very difficult. Luckily, we don't have that issue. This thing is extremely consistent. In the previous video, I did talk about whether it's the right roaster for beginners or not, and I would say that it's probably not for beginners at all, and that's mainly due to the interface. If you were using the version with Artisan, it's going to be easier. But there are definitely some options out there that might be a little bit more attractive. But we will get to those comparisons closer to the end of this video, so sit tight, because it's time to talk about some of the bad stuff. Number one, like I've kind of touched base on, is the usability of it and the interface. It's not great. If you switch this on and the first time roasting, you're going to turn it on and have no idea what to do. There's no direct instructions, and because the automation on this thing isn't good, which we'll talk about very soon, it's maybe not the right roaster for beginners. Another thing that I found probably disappointing, even though it is aimed at a cheaper end, $4,000 is still quite a bit of money, and the build quality of this thing is pretty average. There's no symmetry to this thing, it's not built very well, it's squeaky and nothing fits 100%. But it does roast coffee well, and if that's all you care about, then that's fine. Now, one of the most frustrating things is the amount of time it takes to cool down. So you can't turn the roller off in this thing until you get below 50 degrees Celsius, which takes a long time. I've found myself opening up the windows and blowing compressed air in there just to help bring that temperature down. I don't do it while it's hot because that's probably going to damage things, but it gets to kind of 70 degrees and then plateaus, and it'll stay there for 10-20 minutes until the ambient temperature sort of helps bring it down. Speaking of temperature, the accuracy of this thing is not great. So I have a very accurate thermometer here, and I've tested this thing back to back, and this thing is spot on all the time. I can't say the same for that. Now, a lot of people might be wondering how much the difference is, and it's only a few degrees. But when we're talking about 3 or 4 degrees Celsius, that's a big difference between perfection and a potentially ruined coffee. So if you don't really know what you're doing and understand how to look at the coffee properly, you might have some troubles roasting nicely on this thing. Another thing, This is the chaff drawer, and this is what catches the chaff from the coffee while roasting. It sits underneath the drum, which makes sense as it's gravity fed. It's probably a little bit close for my liking, and if you don't empty this every 2, maybe 3 would be pushing it roasts, it will catch on fire, give you a chaff fire, potentially ruin your roast. And if you pull this out mid-roast, it's going to drop the temperature of your roast. So you really do need to keep an eye on that. I just empty it every single roast. As I mentioned earlier, this is a 400 gram roaster. However, this is your hopper, which sort of just flops on there, and it won't hold 400 grams of coffee, which I find very frustrating. Even though 400 grams is a really odd size to roast anyway, and I do find myself roasting 300 to 320 grams anyway. Now, this is something that might not bother too many people, but it definitely does bother me. I've actually sent a couple of emails and messages out to Kaleido just to sort of test their after-sales service. It's not great. It's very frustrating. I wanted to buy some spare parts and I was unsure as to what we needed, and I haven't heard back from them, and the message I did get back from the Instagram message was really not helpful at all. So that's something they definitely need to work on if they want to sell more of these products in the country. Now, I found this to be the most frustrating thing about this roaster. It would be the auto mode. In the previous video, I did a completely manual roast to show you guys how to use it, and I was just hunting with the heat of the roaster. I'm going to turn the machine on, give you guys a run through the manual mode and the auto mode. Heads up, the auto mode will ruin the coffee. So I've switched the roaster on. I haven't started heating it up yet because it's already warm enough in here. But I do want to show you guys definitely the most frustrating thing about this roaster. Okay, so this is the main user interface. As you can see here, we're in manual mode. You can change that down the bottom here, but this is the mode that I used in the previous video. If you do want to check that out, I've got the link below just to sort of see exactly what I'm talking about. But in that video, we did a roast and I saved it. This is the Burundi. Let's load that, and it brings it up here. Now the 2 lines we're going to look at here is number 1, the pink line, which is your fire line. So you can control that with the plus and the minus. So you can push that around the whole way. You can do whatever you want there. I'm not going to talk about recipes. The other line we're going to look at is this red line here. This is your bean temperature. So this is how hot your coffee is. So when you get to the ideal temperature is when you drop the coffee and the roast is over. So let's leave that on the screen and flick over to the auto mode. So once you're in auto mode, you still have 2 options of how to roast. Number 1 is follow fire, and it will actually follow the pink line exact, which is fantastic. It does that fine, but there's something you really need to keep in mind here, because that doesn't know what that's doing. So if you put 300 grams in, it's going to end up with a very similar line to this, especially if it's the same coffee. But if you put in slightly more or slightly less, or a coffee that has a slightly different density, this line will not do the same thing, therefore you will not get the same roast. And then you have the follow temp. This one will do its best to follow this line, but it doesn't do it well. How it does that is it does its best to keep it at this exact temperature. Unfortunately, all it does is aim for this temperature by cranking the fire temp, and as soon as it hits that, it starts to back off again, but it just keeps going, and you'll just find the temp waving its way through this with the fire bouncing up and down through the whole roast. So I wouldn't recommend using the auto mode at all, but if you are going to, use the follow fire and just ensure you're putting the same amount of coffee in every time. Now, of course, I'm going to roast some coffee because why wouldn't we? I'm going to show you guys how it works, some of the good things about it, because there is still some cool stuff like the little glass window you can see through. There's a little inspection thing like you get on the big roasters. So it is good, but once I've finished the roast, I'm going to kind of give you guys a bit of a summary as to what I think about this and maybe whether or not you should buy one. Okay, so I've let it preheat for a little bit over 10 minutes now. I recommend doing closer to 20, but let's pop some coffee in. So this is 300 grams of a Colombia wheeler that I sell quite a bit of on my website. Link in description if you want to check that out. And what we're going to do is we're going to drop the coffee and hit charge at the same time. Let's go. and we're roasting. As you guys can see, the curve has already started very different. Even though it's the same amount of coffee, it's a different bean which has a different moisture content, so the curve is going to be very different to the previous one. So I'm going to do a bit of an experiment here, and I'm going to follow this fire line as close as I can from the last roast and just see how this curve ends up. And this is going to prove to you that the auto roast mode will not work because it can't physically counteract all the changes in the coffee. First crack there. Let's take some temperature out. So we're going to drop this coffee when the bean temperature gets to 204, which was the same temperature as the last roast I did. And you can already see that that red curve is completely different, proving that you just can't put any coffee in and drop it on auto mode. We're going to pop the cooling switch on because it's not automatic. I'm going to drop. So as you can see, two very different roasts there, even though it's the same amount. Now this is not going to be a perfect coffee because I know that this roast profile just doesn't fit this one. But I wanted you guys to see what it looks like. I know I missed it a little bit here, but you can see how different that is. Very much proving that the auto roast mode over here, it's just not going to do the job. Okay, so now while it's cooling down, there's a couple of things I obviously want to talk about to fill you guys in on my overall opinion of this thing. So I am going to modify this and get rid of that little chaff drawer completely. I'm actually going to run a chute straight into a garbage bin of some sort. Because it's something I don't want to have to think about. I want to be able to focus on roasting the coffee because you have to. Because as you guys can see, the auto mode on this, it's not great. It's just not going to roast coffee consistently. If you don't care and you just want to dump coffee in and walk away, it'll roast the coffee, but you just can't expect any kind of consistency from it with the auto mode. Now with the manual mode, absolutely perfect. It's perfectly fine as long as you can hit those markers every time and change the fire temp as you need be, or don't. Set it on a certain fire. If you want to put it on 50 the whole time and run it to the end and then dump the coffee, it's going to roast the coffee consistently if you do that every time and dump it at the same temperature every time. So my overall thoughts of this roaster. It's definitely not for beginners, which is unfortunate because the price reflects something that beginners would want to buy. And the reason I say that is for about $1,000 more, you can get the Kaleido Bullet, which is better. It is a better roaster. You can't pretend it's not. It looks better. I'm sorry. It does roast better coffee. It is more consistent, and it's a proper roaster built by people who know what they're doing. Now, I was very fortunate and I didn't pay full retail for this. I actually bought it used off a friend of mine, and he had used this 50 odd times, done a few roasts, and he'd actually upgraded his roaster. Now, if I was to do it again, would I buy this roaster for the price I got it? Absolutely. If I had to pay retail, I don't think I would. Now, I'm not saying don't buy a Kaleido roaster. I'm saying I would probably buy the next size up because that'll do the 600 grams, so you can put in about half a kilo at a time. You'll end up with a slightly more consistent coffee as it's very hard to roast small amounts. So overall, if you are looking at one of these at full retail, I would recommend looking at something more like the Kaleido Bullet. I'm not saying buy one of those. This is not a sponsored video by any means. I just don't think that this is the correct roaster to begin with or to finish with. So it's a bit of a filler and it just doesn't really make any sense. But I'm happy with mine for the price I got it for. I'll continue to use it until I outgrow it, and then I will look at something like the Kaleido Bullet or thereabouts. So like I said previously, all of my coffees are available on the website along with merchandise if you would like to contribute and help the channel grow so we can do more things, so I can afford things like the Kaleido Bullet, because I can't afford one of those. Not in the budget, not yet. But a free way to help the channel is to click that subscribe button, hit that like button, especially if this video is helpful to you. Leave a comment, let me know what you think. It costs nothing to do those things, and I would really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have yourselves a great day and happy roasting.